Well, good evening, everyone, and welcome to our presentation tonight on this very warm spring evening of Wednesday, June 5th, 2024. Our presentation this evening is sponsored by the Association of Pittsburgh Priests. Our topic this evening is Confluence, how Laudato Si, Laudato Deum brings ancient wisdom to the environmental global crisis. Our speaker is Karenna Gore, and she is presently the founder and executive director of the Center for Earth Ethics and visiting professor of practice of Earth Ethics at Union Theological Seminary in New York.
Why did I title it Confluence? I was thinking about Pittsburgh, which is not a place that I know very well, but certainly it is legendary. And one of the things that is notable about it is that it sits at a place of confluence where the Monongahela and the Allegheny rivers come together into the Ohio. And of course, later on, the Ohio flows into the Mississippi. And to think about these great waterways and how important they were throughout history for many peoples, for how they shaped our national history. There's a relationship to how the Revolutionary War took shape. And of course, there's a connective point all down to the south of this country. It's also true that the confluence as a concept is very important. It was wonderful. I have to thank you all for the opportunity and the prompt to reread Laudato Si and Laudato Deum because they're so rich. And one of the things that jumped out at me was when Pope Francis, in paragraph 47 of Laudato Si, says, "Great sages of the past run the risk of going unheard now." And I was looking at this book of Rabindranath Tagore, the Bengali poet, and this book of his essays begins with him saying, "You do not know, perhaps, that we have our places of pilgrimage in those spots where the rivers meet in confluence, the rivers which to us are the symbols of the spirit of life in nature, and which in their meeting presents emblems of the meeting of spirits, the meeting of ideals." And so, of course, I'm feel quite blessed to be in a meeting of spirits and ideas with you all here. And I do think that this is a very significant place that you all are from. And of course, there are many other reasons. The such a center of the Industrial Revolution in America, right near where the fossil fuels were first taken out in the way that became such an extractionist obsession, which has led us to the crisis that we are about to talk about. And so I think this is a really powerful place that we're gathering, even though we are doing so virtually. And so I greet you like that. And I also want to say how much respect I have for the best of the Catholic tradition. I myself was I grew up going to Baptist church, and I spent quite a bit of time, and that was in Tennessee and Virginia, Northern Virginia and Middle Tennessee when I was growing up. And then I spent quite a bit of time in Episcopalian institutions. And so I'm quite Protestant, but as I've grown older and visited and gotten to know people and studied, I really am continually impressed and inspired by the depth of what is in Catholic social teaching. And of course, now we know, in large part, due to Pope Francis, that very much includes ecological teachings and the teachings that any ecological approach is also a social approach, and that these two go together. And I wanted to share that where my work is based is at Union Theological Seminary. And the Center for Earth Ethics, which is where I work now, grew out of a conference that happened in 2014. And I wanted to show you this picture because it shows a Catholic priest, Father Edwin Garrigues of the Philippines, who was so gracious to come and to speak to us. He's a Goldman Prize winner, a great environmental and climate justice leader, and he came to speak to that conference. There's also Mary Evelyn Tucker of the Yale Forum on Religion and Ecology, which is a wonderful place of resources for those interested in the broader study of religion and ecology. And Tom Lovejoy, who passed away just a couple of years ago, a scientist and scholar and conservationist. And he's the one that first coined the term biodiversity, actually. And he was there. And then Vandana Shiva, who is from India and is well known for her work in regenerative agriculture, among other things, and really fighting for smallholder farmers and foodways. So the Center for Earth Ethics grew out of this conference. And I wanted to say a word about what we mean by ethics. Ethics is not an exact science, of course, but it pertains to the distinction between right and wrong and the discernment of the implications for that distinction for our behavior as human beings, both as individuals and as collectives. So ethics, of course, undergird many aspects of our society, but actually as a field, ethics is most powerful when there's a widely shared and deeply felt sense of right and wrong that's out of step with both laws and social norms. And during those times, in order to act on that out of step feeling, people need to draw from deeper wells of conscience. So we know the times when that's been the case in the past. In this country, of course, the movement for the abolition of slavery grew from that deeply felt and more widely shared sense that even though all of this was legal, and even though it was along with social norms, it was absolutely wrong. And that was true of women's suffrage in this country, of the civil rights movement more recently. And now it is true of the ecological crisis and the climate crisis in particular. Most of what is driving ecological destruction is actually perfectly legal and even socially encouraged. And that is why ethics, and I think you can say that is a term that applies to Pope Francis's work, and of course he uses it quite commonly and names it as something that we need in order to approach this crisis. So the global ecological circumstances, I'm not going to overwhelm you with a lot of data, because I actually was very struck also that in the beginning of Laudato Si', in the very beginning, Pope Francis says that he sort of warns that reflections on the situation of humanity in the world can sound tiresome and abstract unless they are grounded in fresh analysis of our present situation. And I do not want to be tiresome and abstract, but I just want to show, and actually these two photographs can communicate a lot in this regard. The urgency that we hear from the scientists that are most represented by the IPCC, the International Panel on Climate Change, which is affiliated with the United Nations and has scientists peer review studies all over the world. They have really issued these reports for many years now. And the most recent one, the sixth assessment, I believe it's the most recent, so there's a rapidly closing window to secure a livable and sustainable future for all. And that's really about the climate crisis, but there of course, are multiple facets of the ecological crisis. There is the issue of water, and which is being depleted at a rate faster than can be replenished. There was a study in March 2023 that said the demand may outpace supply by 40% by 2030 of water, just to give you an idea of what people are worried about in that regard. Biodiversity, of course, that just the other species and the wildlife populations have declined by about 69% since 1970. That was a World Wildlife Fund study. And that's about my lifetime, really. Well over half of wildlife populations have gone down. And of course, we have the climate crisis, and we know what that is. We've seen the impacts. We were hearing from Tony before the webinar began about a personal experience in Brazil with a strong storm, and one of these much stronger storms, and how people are affected. It's always the most vulnerable who are affected the most. Basically, another reason why I wanted to share these two images in particular is that one way that I like to think about it is the framing of two modern megatrends when we think about what the circumstances are. And one of them is pollution, and that's pollution into that very thin shell of atmosphere there that you see on the left, which is around the planet. That's what traps the greenhouse gases when they go up there from the emissions. And then depletion. And depletion is, of course, including carbon sinks. And I get this from Gus Speth, who wrote about the two modern megatrends in a book called Red Sky at Morning. But we're doing the pollution and the depletion, and so there's a great effect of being very off balance. There are many ways in which warnings are issued. I find this statement by the current Secretary General Antonio Guterres to be particularly striking. Because, of course, the United Nations was founded in the 1940s in order to prevent war. That was really the main purpose, and you can look at the charter. And, of course, went into development work, economic development work, to end poverty, to keep the peace. But all this time, there was a kind of assumption that nature was, or the environment, as you might say, was sort of a backdrop to that work. And it sort of snuck up on us as a species that this isn't a backdrop. Actually, what's happened is it's the main character, and this current Secretary General says we must end our war on nature. And here, the way he says it is, we're losing our suicidal war against nature. Because of this, and this is since the Industrial Revolution, of course, the experiment with burning fossil fuels, destroying forests, and so on. Basically those two modern megatrends, as others describe it. Now, I want to mention about the distinct ethical dimensions of climate. You all already know this, of course, but it's just one thing that I think is important as I set up the context for why I think Pope Francis's work in Laudato Si and Laudate Deum is so powerful. The irreversibility and uncertainty of certain tipping points. So time is of the essence to change the trajectory that we're on. And we don't know everything as a human species, actually. So even though scientists know a lot, they're warning us that they're not entirely sure when there's something like, for instance, the ice caps in Greenland are melting faster and faster. That's something that Pope Francis mentions in Laudate Deum right up in the beginning. And there's not total certainty as to how all of these ecosystems are interconnected, so that what effect any one of these things may have. So it's not that we are trying to be panic and alarm oriented, but it's just the reality that we should take every precaution right now to do what we know is necessary to stop what's causing the rising emissions. So, and the other thing is that we can actually avoid the peril. So it's not as if there isn't anything that we can do, and you just have to have the serenity to accept the things you cannot change. In fact, we do need the courage to act, because we can do this according to common sense, and also what the scientists have researched and shown, that if we stop that pollution, primarily the greenhouse gas pollution and the depletion, then we can actually restore balance. And then, of course, the global environment is interconnected. Those who one of the central moral issue is, of course, that those who've done the least to cause this problem are being hurt the first and worst. But also, it's true that ultimately it threatens the whole web of life and all of us, and certainly all future generations. And in fact, I find it helpful, this construct from Henrik Grappa of the Church of Sweden, I heard say it, about how in any room where there are decisions made about that it affect the environment, there should be 3 empty chairs for those who are most impacted and least likely to have a say. And that should be 1 for the people who live in poverty and marginalization, 2 for future generations, and the 3rd for all non-human life. And of course, Pope Francis in his work focuses very much on all 3 of these categories. So I want to say, before I pivot to talk about his very powerful work, I just want to say a little bit about where I have learned in this, in the context of being in the movement in this country, how true it is that he focuses Laudato Si on the cry of the earth and the cry of the poor, which is a phrase from Leonardo Boff, originally, and such a powerful one to really reframe the climate crisis. And one of the interesting things is that the same activity that's the primary driver of global climate change, which is the burning of fossil fuels, it also causes that local air pollution that harms human health. And so that causes asthma and cancer and cardiac and respiratory illnesses and so on. And so in this country, the #1 factor of the placement of a toxic facility is the race of the people that live nearby. And the second is income. And so there has been increasingly this awareness. There's something called slow violence. That's a term that's been used by several people, including Coretta Scott King in a certain context. And that is often not as recognizable, obviously, as something that is fast and immediate, but nonetheless, it's lethal. And then there's also this term sacrifice zones, whereby places that have already located toxic sites and have more go there because people have given up on it, or they assume or sometimes take advantage of the fact that the communities that live there have less political and economic ties to be able to effectively fight back. So just this is in the environmental justice movement in this country. This is an example that's often lifted up of when this has become a very powerful movement in this country, led by those people who have been living in what have been termed sacrifice zones. And here's an example from Warren County, North Carolina, from 1980s. There was a Black community. They were going to take these PCB chemicals and dump them in their community, and they laid down in the road in front of the trucks. This is an example of really fighting back against the pattern that's been happening. And this, we don't have to read this really closely. The reason why it's interesting is that this man, Robert Bullard, has become known as the father of environmental justice. And this is his seminal work, Dumping in Dixie, all about exactly that pattern that we were just looking at in Warren County. And really, I just want you to look at the last line here. The last term is sacrifice zone. No community should be allowed to be a sacrifice zone. And he starts out by just saying, this is something that's happened, why some communities get protected and others don't. And we don't want these sacrifice zones to happen. So I want to show this. Ms. Sharon Levine, who is a devout Catholic, has been incredibly effective in fighting against petrochemical factory in her community in Louisiana. And the petrochemical industry is growing. It's in part because it's seen as a growth industry. Pope Francis talks about the throwaway culture in Laudato Si. It's very recent, actually, but as we know, it's quite pervasive, pretty hard to escape it. All these single-use plastic throwaway things, well, they get made somewhere, right? And they get made in these petrochemical factories that emit a lot of toxic pollutions, and also these tiny little thing called nurdles, these little plastic pellets she's been fighting. And so I highly encourage, if you're not familiar already, with the work of Sharon Levine and others to look into that. And as you can see, the way that she talks about it is that she just wants to see the Mississippi River, and again, that's where the Ohio River flows into. So I was thinking about that too. Not full of chemicals, and to see St. James the way it was when I was a little girl. You can't take a deep breath today. And she's really also beautifully motivated, as she talks about in other places, by concern also for wildlife, for her neighbors, including her non-human neighbors, the birds and the plants and so on. So it's been powerful to hear and experience the leadership from these communities. And then the Dakota Access Pipeline fight at Standing Rock is another example I just want to lift up real quick. This happened in 2016. And it was something that was really a turning point for a lot of people who were just getting aware of climate activism, because they actually really reframed the way that people talked about. They said we're protectors, not protesters. We're water protectors. And this banner that says "Defend the Sacred," it was a prayer camp. It was very much about being not only nonviolent but prayerful, and protecting the source of life. Mini Wachoni, water is a life, is another thing that was said around a lot of places after Standing Rock happened. So I wanted to share that. And then this is, of course, another front of where there's been leadership from the front lines. It's just an example of one of the, of course, we don't often see publications, or, we don't see traditional indigenous people who live in the Amazon aren't going to be as often on talk shows or publishing op-eds or writing letters to the editor, but sometimes they do. And this one is an example where Chief Raoni, as we know, the Amazon has faced a lot of deforestation. And I just thought it was striking. Don't worry about reading all the text, but mainly just from him, that we've been warning you that done so much damage to our forest. What you're doing will change the whole world. It will destroy our home and your home too. And we know that that is what is happening even in our part of the world. I shouldn't say even, everything is interconnected in the global environment. So in Houston recently, there was a massive storm knocking over where glass fell out of buildings. There in where I live in New York City, there have been stronger storms over the years, and people have died, including a couple of years ago, people drowned in basement apartments in this city. And it was a very sudden downpour, and unlike anything that had ever happened. So we know that, and right now in India, it's been over 120 degrees, and dozens of people have died already. They've had to close schools. So this is all happening now. And I want to now turn to Laudato Si and Laudate Deum, to Pope Francis's incredible prophetic voice. I really believe that it's an honor to be alive at this time when we can really witness the flourishing of a voice who is able to rise to the occasion. And this is an epic occasion that requires going to the depths and being brave and being strong in the way that he has done on this issue. And so I wanted to start with this quote. I will attempt to get to the roots of the present situation so as to consider not only its symptoms, but also its deepest causes, because I think that itself is ancient wisdom. A lot of times people are just trying to deal with the effects. Let's just cover up the effects, sweep it under the rug kind of thing, put a Band-Aid. And in fact, in order to solve any major problem, you have to look deeper at the level of cause and not just get distracted by covering things up on the level of effects. And that's something that he returns to again and again. And so this is kind of, I'm sorry to do this to you all, but I have a couple of long lists like this, but I don't expect you to read them. I basically just was enjoying going through some of what he identifies as causes in both of these incredible pieces of work. And so I'm just going to mention them. And of course, you all that are familiar with this work know that the easiest way to look things up is by paragraph number, right? So it's not the page number, but the paragraph number. So some of the things that he talks about are this term rapidification. Everything is moving more quickly, right? At a faster pace and scale. And it's moving in pursuit of goals that feel very untethered from the common good, because that's not what they're geared towards. He talks about the throwaway culture. And it not only applies the behaviors that just throw things away, like, it doesn't matter where it'll go, just throw things away all day long. Is also applies to human beings. There are human beings that are affected by this attitude that people have it's become a mentality. It talks about short-sighted approaches to economy, commerce, and production, really leading the way. About viewing other species, and that's all other species. It's animals, but it's plants, it's trees, right? It's soils, it's everything we can that goes into our clothing and our food, and all of these are living beings, right? For the most part, viewing other species simply as resources to be exploited. And then this one, paragraph 56, I think is very powerful, where he talks about the deified market. And of course, that is something that a theme that comes up in other areas as well. He says, many people will deny doing anything wrong because distractions constantly dull our consciousness of just how limited and finite our world really is. As a result, whatever is fragile, like the environment, is defenseless before the interests of a deified market, which becomes the only rule. And I think that's quoting from Evangelii Gaudium, as often there are quotes from other pieces of work, as you all know. Private property over common good, another cause, just to elevate that totally and enshrine it without seeing appropriate limits on that as the goal of society, or the thing that society, nature is primarily viewed as property in a lot of mainstream society now, rather than the commons. So then he talks about the culture of relativism, and what Pope Francis means by that is basically that it's not that people don't apply the same moral sensibility that they would to themselves and their family members to something that's not related to them, to peoples and other species that aren't related to them. And in fact, that it's the mindset of those who would just only think about what does this do for me? How is this good for me? And so that is the culture that prevails. And then the consumerist vision, consumerism obviously is a very big prevailing ethos now. I love this one passage, which is in paragraph 222, where he says a steady stream of consumer goods can baffle the heart. And I think that one of the hallmarks of Pope Francis's work, and actually it's been true of some of the other popes as well, there is a primary focus on the poor, and that is who is centered and lifted. But there's also an understanding that there's a kind of spiritual poverty among the wealthy and affluent of the world that does entail some suffering as well as confusion. And that is one of those phrases when he says a steady stream of consumer goods can baffle the heart, where I think that comes out. And then the self-centered culture of instant gratification is another. Okay, so Laudate Deum, which is just from last year, and very important, interesting piece of work that I want to, I'm still going to list some from Laudato Si, but some overlapping ones are coming next. Laudate Deum is it's much shorter, and it is very much geared towards the practical imperative of having results at these international meetings where climate negotiations are taking place. And it's very hard hitting in terms of holding the powerful people who are standing in the way of progress accountable. but there are other overlapping themes, and so I wanted to just this is causes continued with some of the overlapping ones. So in Laudato Si, Myths of Modernity, there's a passage in which I think it's very interesting because it's also talking about ecological education. Environmental education has broadened its goals, it begins, to include a critique of the myths of modernity, grounded in utilitarian mindset, individualism, unlimited progress, competition, consumerism, and the unregulated market. That those have been kind of lifted up as absolutely good things in and of themselves, and that people are starting to realize that there's a certain myth to all of them. And in Laudate Deum, there is in paragraph 33 this mention of the question of meaning. If all of what has been characterized as progress in modern life leaves that out, then that is missing the point. Then there's a very specific point about environmental impact assessments. Basically, the global ecological destruction is an aggregate of projects and circumstances, right? And there's certain patterns in which it all aggregates to this big biosphere catastrophe. And so the point that he's making there is that, you know, when a project happens, how does this get through when it's going to harm the whole community and take, you know, how is this allowed to happen? And in looking at the specific pattern, basically the impact assessments are not honest and they're not inclusive, and that there needs to be a shift in process and system and accountability whereby local people are consulted about things that are affecting their air and their water and so on. And so it's an important point. And then there's a whole series of causes around, obviously, the global north and the global south, or some people would say the developed world and the developing world. That there's been this sucking of what was seen as resources into global north markets, and that there's a real ecological debt to these countries and peoples that have been stripped of that, while there's been an enrichment in this form of modernity and progress in the rest of the world. Maximization of profits is another cause. You know, just as being allowed to be held and enshrined as a goal above all else. And then I found it very interesting in Laudate Deum, this concept of meritocracy that he brings out, where he says that that mistaken notions also develop about the concept of meritocracy, which becomes seen as a merited human power to which everything must be submitted under the rule of those born with greater possibilities and advantage. So meritocracy can easily become a screen that further consolidates the privileges of a few with great power. Basically, people thinking, well, the way things are is because this is the smartest people got ahead, right? That this is how it's supposed to function, that kind of social Darwinism logic that he's teasing out as one of the causes of how we've gotten here, why we can't fix this problem. And then this is probably the biggest one, the technocratic paradigm. This is something that's very important, whereby Pope Francis says again and again that this idea that technology in and of itself is good, that technology will solve our problems, that we don't need to stop this destruction because we'll have some new inventions that will clean it up, that will get us out of this mess, and that we're missing the real cost in terms of when we adopt some of these technologies, but also it's unrealistic to expect that that's going to be what's going to solve this. And then resistance and confusion and misinformation. This comes out more in Laudate Deum, and I think it does really reflect the fact that what's happening now in our ecological crisis is that there's a shift from totally denying that it is happening or a problem to having these methods of delay, and the idea that there's nothing we can do. And then finally, there's a need, he says that there's a need to reconfigure multilateralism from below, basically that we have to build movements in order to make change. So the spiritual cause is also addressed. All those things I just listed were more on the practical level. And the spiritual level, Pope Francis talks about the rupture and the brokenness of three relationships. This is in paragraph 66, to God, to neighbor, and to the earth, and as a spiritual cause. And it describes it as sin. That is sin, and that is one of the root causes of why we're in this mess. In Laudato Deum, I wanted to lift a couple of quotes here about authentic faith. Gives strength to the human heart and also transforms life, transfigures our goals, and sheds light on our relationship to others and with creation as a whole. And then also, and this last one, my point really is how political, how he's sort of detoxifying the word political. You know, he's explaining that actually we have a pilgrimage of reconciliation with the world. And yes, we need to make it beautiful, and it has to do with our personal dignity. But I cannot deny, and it's necessary and honest to recognize, that the most effective solutions are not from individual efforts alone, but from major political decisions on the national and international level. So thank you for being patient through that. I will refer to a couple of those as I close. But I wanted to go a little bit into a deeper cause of worldview, mindset, and thought system in terms of how we got into this mess, and to talk about that when we had that conference that I opened with the picture Religions for the Earth, if you all recall. There was the same day we opened that conference, there was an essay in a magazine called Science. It was written by a climate scientist and an economist, co-written. And they said, over and above the institutional reforms and policy changes that are required, we need to reorient our attitude towards nature and thereby ourselves. And this man, Dr. Ramanathan, has met with Pope Francis, has been invited to the Vatican, has absolutely seen the power and influence and importance of Pope Francis's work. And he was quoted in an interview saying, 8 decades of research between us in the natural and social sciences led us to the doorsteps of the moral leaders of religions to rescue humanity from climate change. So, I want to talk for a moment about the role of theology. And the reason I'm doing this is because I really think that Pope Francis has been incredibly brave and clear in taking this on. And not totally directly always, but in a very effective way. So there are those that that point to the marriage of institutional Christianity and colonization as a root cause of the ecological crisis. This is from a detail from Vision of the Cross, which is in the Vatican, where the Roman Emperor Constantine had this vision. With this sign you will win, is what he was said to have heard. With his conversion, taking the Roman Empire and institutional Christianity into this partnership. Now, I wanted to just, from Laudato Si, briefly, cite a place where, as he's talking about theology himself and situating the Christian tradition, he says references the writings of the prophets, and then in paragraph 74, he says, centuries later, in another age of trial and persecution, when the Roman Empire was seeking to impose absolute dominion. So there's a recognition that the Roman Empire was interested in absolute dominion. I think that what's been problematic is how much the church and the Vatican and in Christianity became implicated in that. And for those of you that don't know, there is this thesis, this Lynn White thesis, that talks about the historical roots of our ecologic crisis. It was written in 1967, and basically the thesis is the victory of Christianity over paganism was the biggest psychic revolution in our history, because it was telling, it was taking away the animistic spiritualities in these local places, whereby the forests and the streams had their local guardian spirits, and it removed the inhibitions from commodifying and destroying them. And so this has been a controversial thesis. One of the things I find, it's resonated with me based on hearing from Native American people who had a similar experience when they were told that their traditional ways were not valid, or were evil or satanic or something like that. And so I think that there's something to it. But in the end of the Lynn White thesis, he says the greatest spiritual revolutionary in Western history, St. Francis, proposed what he thought was an alternative Christian view of nature. And he tried to substitute the idea of the equality of all creatures, including man, for the idea of man's limitless rule in creation. So I just think it is fascinating and interesting. I'm not saying that he did this because of the Lynn White thesis or anything like that. But when Pope Francis took the name Francis, how powerful that was. And just to show you in this paragraph 66, this is what I cited before when he talks about the spiritual root cause, really, of the ecological crisis himself, Pope Francis. This is where he says that Genesis gives us three fundamental intertwined relationships with God, our neighbor, and the earth. And the rupture of these relationships is sin. Then he says down here, it is significant that the harmony which St. Francis of Assisi experienced with all creatures was seen as healing of that rupture. So I think that's powerful. Now I'm going to go through the rest of mine quickly because I don't want to take too much of your time. But indigenous peoples have really strong knowledge, and this is something Pope Francis has actually done so much work to correct course and really work on respectful relations with indigenous peoples, and it's very meaningful. And I wanted to just say, you know, the Iroquois, known as they call themselves the Haudenosaunee, had this incredible kind of manifesto in 1977 called A Basic Call to Consciousness. And I really, it has some themes in it that you can see similar simpatico with what comes out later in Laudato Si. So I wanted to mention it that way. And they warned against imposing the model of economic development on the rest of the world that they feel was imposed on them right here in these lands here. Of course, the doctrine of discovery and domination is from the papal bulls of the Vatican. This is a painting, like an image like many others that would show Christopher Columbus with the cross, and kind of reflect that mentality that the people there who were not Christian were part of the flora and fauna, were lesser than human. The papal bulls that kind of launched this age of discovery were in 1452 and 1493. The one I want to say is that, and sorry about all the text, I just want to say Pope Francis and his Vatican actually repudiated the doctrine of discovery. And I just think it's very powerful that this was done, and it really is in keeping with the teaching of how to heal. And so you can see that he says the church is, although this was never Catholic teaching itself, we acknowledge that it was done without opposition from ecclesiastical authorities sometimes, and we repudiate it. And he's also gone into great detail in Laudato Si to unravel that interpretation of dominion as domination. And here are some examples where it's not a correct interpretation. We must forcefully reject the notion that dominion means absolute domination. And so I just want to, I'm in the home stretch. I want to just lift up a couple ways in which I really think that that Pope Francis's work puts us on really the most important ethical path now where we are in this climate and ecological movement. This is a woman named Robin Wall Kimmerer. For those not familiar, is a Native American woman and also a botanist, a scientist who's written several books, one called Braiding Sweetgrass. And she talks about restoring relationships. So it's very resonant of Pope Francis's idea of repairing that rupture in the relationships that he talks about. And this is about ecological restoration work, but she says restoring land without restoring our relationship is an empty exercise because it's relationship that will endure. So connecting people and landscape is as essential as reestablishing proper hydrology or cleaning up contaminants. And I think it's really, for those of us who are from this country, from this region, and particularly those of European descent, I would say, I think the mentality has, it's terrible to generalize, but there has been a kind of inherited mentality that is not naturally inclined to make these long-term reciprocal relationships to place. And so it's really beautiful to see that this is something that that's coming out through Pope Francis's work. Also in paragraph 84 in Laudato Si, he talks about particular places. He says the entire material universe speaks of God's love, his boundless affection for us, soil, water, mountains. Everything is, as it were, a caress of God. The history of our friendship with God is linked to particular places. And then he brings us to bring to mind these places where you have a chance to recover something of your true self. Now, another area where I think he's in such a strong leadership is this technocratic paradigm, because right now, and you can see this cover of the New York Times Magazine here, can we engineer our way out of the climate crisis? That's the cover of the New York Times Magazine. So rather than stopping those modern megatrends, of pollution and depletion, rather than, shifting, reducing the waste and the consumption and throwaway culture, and also making those shifts to renewable energies that are available, there are those that would rather stay with what we're doing and just hope that we can invest in things like carbon capture and sequestration or solar radiation management even, which is a type of geoengineering that they're doing research on, that would rely on reflective particles in the sky to reflect back the heat. I mean, this is something that there are people putting millions of dollars of research money into. It's not that it's happening right now, but this is the kind of what they call a moral hazard, right? That these kinds of technologies are dangled out there so that the people who have a vested interest in the status quo don't have to change. Okay, I know I'm running over. And this technological optimism is another way that it's put in the discourses of delay. And this is one other thing I wanted to say is that, I mentioned before how in Laudato Deum, he was not afraid to say political solutions are what is needed. And sorry, that example was too complicated, but basically there's a lot of maligning of political, that people will say, oh, that's political, we don't want to go there. Don't say that, it's political. Or they'll say it's politically motivated when people have a bill to reduce fossil fuels. But the idea of political is something that we need to reclaim if we're going to have ethical, collective decision-making. Reinhold Niebuhr was at Union Theological Seminary for most of his career, which is where the Center for Earth Ethics is based. And so that's why I include him here with a quote from his book, Moral Man and Immoral Society. All justice in the less intimate relations is political. Structural evil is another thing that comes up that Pope Francis is very good at teasing out with the moral claims and the moral reasoning. Structural evil, of course, Domhilder, Camera, and other great luminaries of Catholic social teaching have brought that out. But basically, there are moral claims that are used to just justify the status quo that we're on. All those things that were the causes that were listed in the beginning, that Pope Francis identifies to say, well, we need those things because we need jobs. We need economic growth. And so moral claims and moral reasoning is to examine these claims before repeating them and also ask those deeper questions. This woman, Cynthia Mo-Lebeda, did a work in which she pointed out one key characteristic of structural evil is that it easily masquerades as good. So you have to look out for those claims. Because a lot of times that's where it hides. And that's why we continue on this trajectory. The cry of the earth, the cry of the poor It's ever more true, as we've heard from firsthand reports of who's being hurt first and worst. There was a UN Special Rapporteur on Extreme Poverty and Human Rights report that detailed this recently. So anybody who says that we need to continue fossil fuel use because of development issues, because of ending poverty, has to be, as Pope Francis does, has to be forced to look at the fact that, in fact, climate change threatens to undo the last 50 years of development and poverty reduction and would push more people. So I'm going to close, and I apologize for going a little bit over. Yeah, that's going to be my last one. I'm going to close, and thank you for your patience, with words from Erin Lozes Bibiano, who I'm very happy to say is a colleague at the Center for Earth Ethics, and a wonderful theologian and teacher. And she wrote the introduction to one of the published versions, at least, of Laudate Deum. And in it, one of her wise quotes is that the Catechism teaches that all are called to be co-creators, neither vandals who destroy the natural order of creation, nor misers who hoard our power and profits out of narrow self-interest. Creation is ongoing, and change is a part of it. To develop as a society is to adopt ever more beautiful cultural habits, choosing sustainability and health, embracing the best of technology, and the traditional wisdom of simplicity, focusing on decent work, family, and community life. And so I think that brings us back to that spirit of confluence, whereby we are in an unprecedented, modern, contemporary situation. It is very anxiety-provoking, it's complex, it's confusing, it's fast-moving, but we have this very powerful, life-giving stream of wisdom coming from the prophetic voice of Pope Francis. And I, for one, am so deeply grateful for his leadership, and to you all for inviting me to share tonight. So apologies for going over. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Karenna. That was so profound. Karenna, I wondered if you would talk a little bit about, and I think you alluded to it later in your talk, about it's not just what we would do individually, but how we can get more involved in our advocacy and our political power. And I would use the example of the fossil fuel non-proliferation treaty. The Native Americans have put out to send certain letters to the Congress to preserve sacred lands and to end the pipelines, those things. If you can expand on that, in addition to talking a little bit about environmental racism, and of course you've alluded to that, but if you would start with that, and then I open it up to anyone else who would like to speak.
Thank you so much. I think that there are different levels to engage in a civic way. There's obviously local and state and national and international. And I know that there are people from all over probably on this call. But of course, in Pennsylvania, you're in a state that has historically been important in national politics. We do have an election coming up in which I think that it's important that people understand how to participate and what the difference between the candidates are, on this issue. And then in terms of the state, what's on the legislative docket right now, I wouldn't feel I should have done my homework to be more informed about specifically what. But I do think that what's important is to reduce emissions, accelerating the transition to clean, renewable energy. I know that in New York, we have the Heat Act. We have some efforts. We have congestion pricing, which is, people are kind of going back on. There are efforts that would really reduce emissions, like not having natural gas in new construction projects, trying to get things converted to renewable energy and so on, that are very important on the state level. Globally, we're Center for Earth Ethics is involved in coalition break free from plastics to go for a plastics treaty,
Mm.
keeping in mind, Sharon Levine and also all of the non-human life that suffers from the choking of the waterways and so on from plastic pollution. And so you can always call and talk to your senators about whether they know about the treaty and whether the U.S. can support a strong plastics treaty. At Inc. 4 is the process or the meeting that just happened, moving towards that treaty. Break free from plastics, beyond plastics. There are a couple coalitions. So I think that getting involved in that way, where you know what the legislation is and really showing up and calling the elected representatives as well as voting or talking to people about it and getting involved in movements, it can be really tiresome and tedious and draining. So what's good is to do it with people. And I know that many of you probably already do that, so I would say thank you to whoever does. But that, I think, is the most important thing. And then of course there's also, you can make your own practice, not just as a consumer, what you buy, but also in terms of your thought process and the rituals and prayers that you do. I do believe that that can make a difference in guiding behavior and consciousness and how you speak to others. And I think just starting to bring these things to mind, with the spiritual depth that certainly is presented in parts of these pieces of work by Pope Francis, in and of itself, can make a difference and unfold in ways that we may not even predict.
Great. Thank you so much.
Tina, for this wonderful, enlightening presentation which you have made to us this evening. I have a question about solar energy in the United States. We have tremendous resources of solar energy, but the resistance at all levels of government and at other levels as well to the use of solar energy is, to me, devastating. In a sense, it is one of the easy technical solutions or part solution to our tremendous ecological problem. Could you say a few words about solar energy and how we might exploit that as a way to reduce our carbon footprint?
Yes, thank you so much. First of all, thank you for your kind words and for that very important question. Yes, solar energy is so underutilized. The sun, I don't know if you all were anywhere near the eclipse recently, but that was a kind of a great blessing that people became more aware of the sun. Then there was a solar flare that caused that some people saw the aurora borealis, the northern lights. I feel it's almost like the sun's trying to tell us something, to pay more attention. This Bill McKibben, who's an environmental writer I admire, says, like, God loved us so much, he hung a great big ball of fire in the sky for that has all of our needs, could actually power a lot more of the I mean, I've heard different statistics, but basically, people do think that if it were harnessed, would take care of everything with the technology that we have available. The International Energy Agency has done studies to show that we actually have the technology that we need. It's not like we're lacking for that. We just need to have the political will to implement it. Okay. So I think that the barriers to it have to do again with I mean, there's a natural human inertia to make change, right? You know, all of us have it. Like for myself, I still have a gas stove in my apartment. I've been meaning to get it to switch it out to an induction stove. You know, that's something I will do. It just making the effort to make the change. It's the same thing to do if you are going to put solar panels on your roof as an individual. But and not everybody has that capability. But if you are in a situation where you have a home where you can do that, but when it comes to collective decision making, there are people whose jobs that are to look after the common good. That's how it used to be understood. If you're a public, you know, if you're an elected representative, a public servant, and a lot of the times what happens is that we have people in electoral politics who are taking donations. It's like it's legal, but it's still kind of like bribery, but it's legal. And the industry has done that over years to block the transition to solar because they want to keep people on fossil fuels. So I think that we have our work to cut out for us to do that systemic work. I would recommend, you know, in terms, and I'm so sorry if I haven't given as practical an answer as is called for. But it does kind of vary on specific situations. I know that there are like Interfaith Power and Light, for example, is an organization, a faith-based, an interfaith organization that works in part on helping like houses of worship and religious communities to have more easy transitions to renewable energy. So that might be a place to find some resources. And I absolutely think that it's the right way to go, but it is a big fight in part because of those entrenched interests. The other thing is that the Inflation Reduction Act that was passed in the past few years by the current administration has some incentives in it. And apparently one of the things is that you have to actually pursue them. They have incentives to switch to renewable energy, but so you could call a local, you know, elected official or the EPA, you know, should have some kind of guidance in order to take advantage of those credits that they have and incentives that they have, which I think a lot of people don't know how to, just don't know are there. So I'm sure someone else has a better answer, and I wish they'd speak up if they do. But I also know someone else has their hand up, so I'll turn it back.
Thank you. Yeah, thank you for an excellent presentation. I have two slightly different questions. One is about a fossil fuel treaty and what you think might be the possibility of the development of a fossil fuel treaty, and it's coming into effect. And the second is I did unmute myself. Can you hear me?
Yeah, we can hear you, Joanne. Go ahead.
Thank you. And the other is how much attention do you think are these two wonderful encyclicals being given in the church? I mean, are you encouraged by a number of Catholics all over the world addressing this or not?
So the first about the fossil fuel you know, non-proliferation treaty, I think it's been called. I think, you know, I think I absolutely would be great. I think it's amazing that it's only been recently that they've really named the problem. You know, even in the Paris Agreement and in these international conferences about climate change, there was a reluctance to actually name fossil fuels, because it really it's such a powerful lobby that controls so much of the discourse that people wanted to sort of say, well, it's very complicated and kind of talk about causes in a different way. But it's now that we have the capacity with wind and solar in particular, renewable clean energies and energy efficiency to make a transition. I absolutely think it would be great to have a fossil fuel non-proliferation treaty. I think that the process that's underway in the COPs, and most recently it was in Dubai, and the next one's in Azerbaijan, I think, and then there's one in Brazil, which is the one that people have, I think, hopes for in terms of being in a place where they have, you know, made a transition in their government from a climate denying and hostile, you know, to the environment government to one more friendly and forward thinking on climate, and hopefully would stick with that and host a meeting that can be that can phase out fossil fuels. That was a big argument at the last COP was, you know, can we talk about phasing out fossil fuels? And in the final text, it didn't get there, but it got closer than they thought that they would. So, but that's not binding, right? That's not the same. These are all like aspirations and goals, and it's one of the things in Laudato Deum that Pope Francis has very stern language about, that it absolutely has to be, you know, then one can only hope for binding forms of energy transition that meet three conditions: that they be efficient, obligatory, and readily monitored. This in order to achieve the beginning of a new process marked by the three requirements, and that it be drastic, intense, and count on the commitment of all. That's in paragraph 59 in Laudato Deum. So I think it'd be great. And I think you had to have that treaty, but I don't know how close it is. And then you were talking about whether or not it's made a difference having these documents in the Catholic Church and the Catholic community. So I have heard from people who feel disappointed that it hasn't made more of a difference in terms of the, I mean, there, you know, the way people vote, for example, in important elections, and whether you count it based on who's Catholic in swing states that make all the difference. You know, sometimes people focus on that kind of thing. But we all know that belonging, you know, in that way of religious communities is very complex in terms of how people are making those decisions. But that would be one way in which I've heard disappointment expressed sometimes, that it hasn't had more of an effect. Also, that you know, there could be more done with the range of schools and hospitals, the institutions that could switch to renewable energy, that could, you know, start to lead the way in terms of demonstrating. But I've also been with Catholic communities that are, you know, it takes some time, I think. And I was up in Mariandale with the Dominican sisters recently, who are doing a bunch of beautiful regenerative, you know, work and convening conversations and have, you know, prayer lives and well, hosting. What I mean by that is that it's reflected in language and practices and rituals and the way that people are talking, and that does take a little while. Prioritizing you know, relations with non-human life, bringing in local environmental groups, learning more about things. So I've seen specific Catholic communities where this is really working well. And like I lifted up Sharon Levine, you know, who's a person of great Catholic faith. So I would love to hear the answer that you all have to that question. But I guess mine is mixed. My answer is a bit mixed.
Thanks, Karenna, for that. I'm going to call on Dawn, but I just want to say, if you all go to fossilfueltreaty.org, there is a treaty that's in the motion. It's very detailed. There's a lot of resources, but you can sign on as an individual in support of it, as an organization, and they advocate that you try to get levels of government to also. So right now, our local Sierra Club is trying to get our county council and our city council to sign on in support of the treaty as well. So just wanted to let everyone know about that. And Dawn, you'll be the last.
Okay. It's interesting that you bring up so many of these fundamental questions. I was just at a township meeting last night where a developer wanted to take a farm and put in 224 housing units and so on. And many of the neighbors were trying to fight this, and because it destroys the rural residential character of the neighborhood. And what seems to come down to, and it was ultimately approved in a closed vote by the supervisors because they felt they couldn't deny that person his right to use his property as he saw fit. So what we see in that example and in Pope Francis's thing, what it comes down to is how do we restore that right relationship to the earth and the land and non-human creation within our legal system, which is so heavily weighted toward individual property rights. Do you see anybody working on how to bring that into legal language? Because right now there is no way that you could fight those things in the court. That person, no matter how detrimental it is, can, is free to do with that land or, those living creatures on that land, the trees and everything, whatever he wants to do.
Yeah, yeah. A really good question. And I think, so there's this movement which is known as the rights of nature movement, rights, RIGHTS, or a movement to ecocentric law that is trying to actually really go to a more radical solution to exactly the problem that you've identified, whereby, because of the fact that that in property law, you can, if you own it, you can destroy it, and it doesn't matter that it's land and connected to underground water and air that affects everybody else, and that it's a thoroughfare for wildlife or whatever it is, that the private property sort of paradigm has just absolutely reigned in terms of how we've related to nature in this way. And basically, the shift to rights of nature would mean that nature is seen as alive and having its own intrinsic, very similar to what comes in Pope Francis's work around, there's intrinsic worth to other species. It's not just how its resources and objects exploitable and by the market. There has to be some sense of agency and intrinsic worth, so that if you, and of course the work of Thomas Berry has been very important to me, and I didn't fit it into the presentation, but one of his famous quotes, and he was a Catholic priest at one point, or a theologian, is that the great work of our time is to realize that we're living within a communion of subjects, not a collection of objects. That's what the universe is. That's what the earth is. And we've been trained to think it's all objects. Even other creatures and trees and the river and the water, whatever. And it's subjects. These are fully alive beings. And so the rights of nature would give legal standing to natural entities like forests and rivers, and it wouldn't mean the same thing as human rights. It'd be like, the rights of the forest, the rights of the river. And so in a case where there is a kind of a development project that's going to happen, it's not the actual, if there's a natural entity that would be harmed, that would have legal standing. So if a forest is going to be cut down, that there could be a legal suit brought on behalf of the forest. And there's a whole interesting history to it, whereby there was a law review article called "Should Trees Have Standing" by Christopher Stone in the Law Review. And then there was a dissent in a case called Sierra Club versus Morton, in which Justice Douglas wrote that a river is the ecological unit of life, should be a plaintiff. Like that because it represents a whole bunch of life in there. They should be able to be a plaintiff in court. And that has not prevailed. So there's been a rights of nature movement that's tried to make this shift, and it hasn't happened. But that would be ecocentric law, rights of nature, and you can look up community. So the Center for Democratic and Environmental Rights, CDER, is working on this. The Center for Democratic and Environmental Rights. The Earth Law Center is another one. Global Alliance for Rights of Nature, and Community Environment Legal Defense Fund is another one, CELDF, CELDF, and they're all full of resources and about this particular shift. The other thing I'll just say quickly is that there's also this idea that rather than rights of nature themselves, that there's this movement for right to a healthy environment, right? And there's what they call green amendments. So New York has a green amendment, a right to a healthy environment in the state constitution. I'm assuming Pennsylvania does not have this. I think it'd be really, you were going to say?
No, we do have it in one of the
do?
first. Yes.
Oh, so tell me about it.
Yes, it's I think it was adopted in 1980, something like there, where all residents have the right to clean air, clean water
Okay.
by right, and it's was a constitutional amendment.
I should know that, and thank you for correcting me. Does it make any difference?
It did in one case with the fracking industry. That was brought as the reason, and it went all the way to the Supreme Court, and that was the reason. They ruled in favor of the anti-fracking.
So thanks, and I get what I'm told by people who know this world, lawyers that work in this world, is that there's potential, right, for jurisprudence to unfold, even if it hasn't already, with these kinds of amendments. And maybe there can even be community ordinances that are more localized that try to express it, and we can start to try to make this shift. Because I think when people compare it like to the civil rights movement, they say, look, everybody thought it was impossible to desegregate schools. You just have to keep trying and trying and trying and trying, and they say no, 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 and then finally it bursts through because the ethical argument and the movement is strong enough. So I think what you've identified as the problem, more and more people maybe feel, and then matching up with that kind of a movement, I think it'd be great. But I'd love to talk more sometime about it. Thank you.
Thanks so much. And Karenna, we're just going to give you an opportunity if you can give us a few sentences just in closing, anything that you want to close us off with, any thoughts?
Oh, thank you so much. I really just want to say that I'm grateful for the chance to be thinking like this with you, and just feel the spirit of inquiry and presence and sort of generous encounter that you all are offering here in this virtual circle, and just to say that I really am genuinely moved by the work of Pope Francis. I think that I said a little bit more about his critiques than I did about some of the positive things that he mentions, but he talks about a culture of care. He talks about ecological citizenship, and integral ecology, of course, is a theme. I think that the vision is really coherent and comprehensive and achievable to follow this path. And I think that those of us that are involved in education, but also on all forms, just in terms of being together in community, even like this, it's like informal education circles where we're all learning from each other. That we all really are doing that work slowly. And I just wanted to give you my respect and gratitude for the chance to be a part of it like that. So thank you.
Oh, thanks so much.